Lord be with you.
The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty Father, we ask that as we read your word, that you would guide and direct us to know your will for our lives as your children. All this we pray in your precious and holy name. Amen. Is that a little too loud? Are we good? I'll make sure not to do any yelling. Probably. We'll blame Kevin if a speaker goes, oh. There you go. Kevin. We'll blame Kevin. All right, so we are into another book. Week number 14, we're on to the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah. If you remember, those first 5 books are the Torah, the Pentateuch. They're written by Moses. We're at the end of Moses's time. Deuteronomy itself is made up of, we'll get to it in a little bit actually, but you can look at it in 2 different ways, but what it's made up of is Moses's 3. Is Kevin playing games or am I just? Okay. I don't know. It would be. He's probably listening to all of this. Deuteronomy is made up of 3 sermons that Moses gives to the Israelites as they're at the edge of the Jordan River. So at the beginning, we hear the Lord say to Moses, hey, y'all have been sitting here long enough. Your 40 years is up. Get moving over to Israel. And so they start the trek, and there they are at the Jordan River. They've beaten 2 enemies, and they're ready to enter the promised land. And that is where Deuteronomy picks up with, and these 3 sermons, these 3 addresses that Moses gives to the Israelites to prepare them for what is coming. Because he also is not going to be entering the promised land. He talks a little bit about that in these sermons as well, but he will have Joshua taking over after him. And so these sermons act as both a preparation, hey, get ready, this is a rallying speech of sorts, a remembering of the covenant, and also a looking ahead. This is the new generation. These are the kids of the people who God brought up out of Egypt. So this is the younger generation. This is a reminding of them of how to live their life according to the covenant. So Deuteronomy, living life with a covenant mind. It readdresses just about everything that we have gone over in the last 4 books. This is Moses's rehashing. He's taught them for the last 40 years, and he needs to give the summary of what they've done. And so here it is with Deuteronomy. You can see there the Greek Deuteronomy comes from deutero, which sounds like duo, so that's from the word 2, or second, something along those lines, the cardinal number if you like it. And then nomion comes from nomos, which is the word for law. So Deuteronomy, deuteronomion, is second law. That's what you can fill into those blanks if you would like to. Not so much as a second law as in, hey, here is a new one for you, but the second and last time that Moses is giving it to his people. This is the second time that the covenant is being reiterated to Israel. So that is where this phrase, the second law, comes from. And when we look at Deuteronomy, there is a key verse to it. I would say it's the key verse. It's at least the one most remembered from Deuteronomy, which is the Shema. Deuteronomy 6:4-5. The Shema is the Hebrew word for listen or hear. Shema. So hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This is the Shema. You'll hear it repeated often by the Jews, especially that first verse. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. It's only like 4 words for them, maybe 5. Shema Yisrael, that's 2. Adonai, for Yahweh, because they won't say Yahweh's name. So Adonai, my Lord. Eloheinu, our God. Adonai, Yahweh. Ahad is one. So 6 words. 6 words to make it up. Maybe it's not that much shorter. I just wanted to say the Hebrew. I don't get to say it very often. I'm getting a little golf clap from Pastor back there. Yeah. So that is kind of a key theme verse for them, named for the first word of the verse, repeated throughout the day, twice a day, kind of minimum, that the Jews were to repeat this phrase, this statement of the covenant of who God is. They, as Moses goes on, they talk about putting this on your head and on your hand. And so the Jews will wear I'm forgetting the actual name, but it's the box, the frontal. So they have one on their forehead and they have one on their hand, and in it are these verses written on paper in them, and they touch those to the ground, I believe, when they pray over those words. So it's a very meaningful aspect of the Jewish customs when it comes to these verses here. The Shema is also repeated much in the New Testament. This is what Jesus quotes when the rich young ruler when they come and ask him at any time, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus will say, love the Lord the greatest is this, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And the second is, anybody want to say it?
Love your neighbor.
Love your neighbor as yourself. The summary of the 10 commandments really is the first table looking towards God, our upwards relationship. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And then our horizontal relationship with our neighbors, love your neighbor as yourself. And so this is a phrase that Jesus himself quoted. He would have known about it well, which helps us as we address this other fact. When it comes to talking to Jews and talking to Old Testament people, the Shema is one of the verses which we as Christians must address, as this verse is where Jews will point to in order to say that Christians are blasphemers. This is the tenet of monotheism, right? The Lord our God is one. There can't be another. And so they don't view Jesus, they view us saying that Jesus is God. When Jesus referenced himself as God, this is why they called him a blasphemer, because they won't see it in their minds that way. And we'll get to it a little bit later towards the end, but I will give the look ahead that what we'll look to explain this verse is a clear divide that we'll find between creator and creation. And we'll get to that a little bit more later. I didn't want to jump too far ahead, but it got spread out and all that fun stuff. We'll keep moving. I know it's 8 pages, but don't worry, it's a spread out 8 pages. I had like 5 or 6 pages worth of stuff, and I didn't want to shorten it to 4. So we'll get through it. So 2 ways to look at Deuteronomy. Like I mentioned before, these are the 3 sermons that Moses gives to Israel, but you can look at it in 2 different ways, especially as we look to the big picture. A big thing that we're looking at is the big picture. We want to view everything. We're not looking at an individual part, but what is Deuteronomy, the book, as a whole, and how does it fit into the Old Testament timeline? How does it fit into what is happening? And so there are 2 different ways that we can look at Deuteronomy. The first one, as we've kind of talked about, is by address. Deuteronomy is made up of 3 sermons, and this way of looking at Deuteronomy splits the book up into 3 sections based on the purposes of the sermons that Moses is giving. So the first one is what we fully read this week, chapters 1 through most of 4, and that's the historical prologue. You'll hear about it in the sermon as well. This is the retelling of events, starting with creation, and then fast forwarding to the commandments and bringing up out of Egypt and the moving on from there. And it's a rehashing of what has gone on in the Israelites' life since God has called them. The second address we've started, but we'll continue on through the majority of the book, the stipulations of the covenant. This is where we read the 10 commandments for the second time, and we get reintroduced to the moral law again for the Israelites. Remember that this is that new generation, so they need to hear all of this again. This is kind of Moses's get ready for your final, right? Because they're going to take the test and then they're going to have to deal without him as their teacher anymore. So this is him once again reiterating the covenant to them. The third address is another covenant, and then we end with the change of leadership. So that's how we look at it if we're splitting it up based on the words that Moses is saying. But there is another interesting way to look at it based on covenant, and there's a picture there so you can kind of see them side by side. But by covenant, Deuteronomy largely follows a covenant form used frequently in the ancient Near East when it's between two peoples. Archaeologists have found this and found examples of this, and there are two main treaties that tend to be used in the ancient Near East. Ancient Near East looking at the Middle East today, right? I don't know why it's switched around. It's not the Near East anymore, but the Middle East, that's the ancient Near East. There's two kind of main forms, especially in this Canaanite area of treaties. And it ends up, we'll come back to that picture after, but it looks like a parity treaty, which is between two equal ranks, two equal people coming together to make a decision, or the suzerain, I'm going to guess that's said correctly, suzerain vassal treaty. The more powerful country or leader, the suzerain, could impose conditions and obligations on the weaker vassal. So this happened when a nation was defeated. Pastor's laughing, so I did something.
You and I have suzerain vassal.
Oh, okay. Yes, so I have had conditions and obligations imposed on me as the weaker vessel. I don't often get called the weaker vassal. Will do. So in this, usually through a case of war, but I guess also a case of vicarage, and let's be real, the vicars are defeated people. No. Usually through war or something along those lines, or maybe they saw how strong the army was and didn't want to go to war. And so the greater nation will say, all right, look, you've seen how great our army is. We could absolutely demolish you and destroy you in an instant. But look at what we've done for you. You're going to go into this covenant with us. Here's what you have to do. And if you do this, we will continue to protect you. The suzerain's responsibility was protection of their vassals. The vassal's responsibility was the rest of the obligations that the suzerain put on them. So as the weaker vassal, my job is to play Mr. President with Pastor. I've got to... Yeah. All right, I'll stop making those jokes. So the common parts of the suzerain vassal treaty. There is the preamble, the suzerain introduced. Then we move into the historical prologue where the suzerain's described, also the good that he's done for them, and the different events that the suzerain has done that the people should know about. This is who is going to be leading you, right? So they want to make sure that they understand who their ruler, essentially, who their suzerain is. Then we move on to stipulations. There are imposed rules, regulations, decrees on the vassal that they need to follow. A lot of the times between nations, this would look like, you can't have a standing army at our border. You have to pay us money regularly. You, when you move into some of the more controlling ones, you have to follow our gods. And so these sort of things are the regulations that they will have, but it could be many different aspects of that. It doesn't have to just be those three. Moving on, there's also the provisions for preservation and rereading the covenant. Lots of big words to say, hey, keep this safe and read it often. But we like big words in theology, I guess. So copies of the documents, they were going to be placed in significant spots. They would be in a throne room. They would be in a safe. They would be in a place where you see it regularly as the reminder that, hey, you are in this covenant. We are in this covenant together. And it had to be read at regular intervals to remind the people what the covenant said.
An example of this would be, many of us were kids. They were out in the public courtyard.
So what Pastor said, the example would be for many of us, not me, but Ten Commandments, where they were visible and in the courtyard. So that would have been the covenant in a visible place for us to read and remember often. Okay, out in front of the eagles, you can still find one. All right. Then there's the call to witness. The suzerain and vassal would provide a list of their gods who would witness the covenant, ensure both parties obeyed, and a list of blessings or curses. Or if you mess up, I'm going to hurt you. If you do well, we'll be okay. That's about how that goes. If the vassal obeyed, things would go well. If they disobeyed, the suzerain would destroy him and all he owned. I'm feeling in danger. So there are always some differences that exist. For instance, between Pastor and I, it's unlikely that I will have everything I own destroyed. But I might not pass my paper if I push that button. So some differences do exist. Sometimes the stipulations were general and then more specified, so they would start wide and get narrower. Sometimes they would just have one or the other. Maybe it'd be just a few. Maybe it'd be a whole lot like 613 Mosaic laws. Who knows? The order of the last three portions, so that would be the provisions, the call to witness, and the list of blessings, they weren't always in the same order, and not every treaty contained every part. So if we go back up to that picture, we can kind of see the parts that we have in the Treaty of Deuteronomy. So we get the preamble, which is God introducing himself in those first 5 verses. The Lord said to Moses. Then we get the first sermon, which is the historical prologue. We hear the history of what God has done for his people. And then with the second sermon, most of the second sermon is the stipulations of the covenant. We get the moral law, then we move to the ceremonial law, and we have the civil law. We don't see as clear of a distinction of that in the previous books, but what Moses is doing here is essentially this, right? He's taking everything that's happened and he's making a nice clear form of it so that you have the Israelites now have a nice handy handout with everything summarized and formal and clear to understand for the people. So he has those 3 separations there. We look at the ratification of the covenant in those final chapters. And then we don't have a blessings and curses. It kind of goes along with the law. This is the first law that will go well with you. And I'm completely botching that phrase, so I'm going to keep moving on. And instead of blessings and curses, we have leadership succession under the covenant. We see that Moses isn't going to enter the promised land. He's made that clear. He's blamed the Israelites for it. In the historic stipulations, he's like, because you were such a stubborn and rebellious people, now God won't even let me enter. So Moses was a little salty on that one, but understandable, I guess. If you've been the Lord's prophet, maybe you want to actually enter the promised land. But Moses doesn't get to, and so he sets up the succession for Joshua to take over after he dies. For your fun fact of what's debated in Deuteronomy, sometimes they argue whether those last verses were written by Joshua to fill in since Moses is kind of already dead, or if Moses wrote that he died and then kept finishing the book. Fun stuff like that. Continuing on. So those are the 2 ways that we can look at Deuteronomy, by address or by covenant. They follow a similar line. The by covenant just adds a few extra pieces to it, separating it out a little bit so that we can so that we can see the different parts of the covenant. So we specifically ended up reading, that was your big Deuteronomy overview. That's why we have 8 pages. I would have felt bad if we started a book and I didn't get to give you the big picture before we dived in. So the first sermon, some historical prologue. Moses' first sermon, it covers the history of Israel. This should sound very similar to what we've read in the first 4 books because it is Israel's history. He's repeating what has happened through Exodus, not really Leviticus because it's not a ton of story in Leviticus, and Numbers. He's repeating what has gone on so the people can hear once again what has happened. Is it Kevin or is it just no? It's not Kevin because he's standing back there. I blamed you earlier, Kevin. Okay. So he's repeating this to tell it to the younger generation. They must know that they belong to the God who brought them up out of Egypt. That's not fresh in their minds anymore. That wasn't them who they brought up. That was their parents, right? So you're at a point, I mean, you can look at it on the American side, the Gen Z and Gen Alpha, 9/11 is not as present in their minds anymore because they didn't live through it. Or at least I don't remember it. I was 3 years old at the time, right? So we don't, thanks Art for the laugh. I'm young. I'm a weaker vassal. 40 years. A little bit over because of the year and a half they were traveling from Egypt to the border, and then they rebelled, and then they got 40 years of wandering. So 41 to 42 years total since they were brought out of Egypt. And the lifetime was younger due to the harsher conditions. So 40 years, a lot of the new generation would have been younger. They might not remember the bringing up out of Israel. They would have had God providing for them. And we see that throughout Numbers that God continued to provide for them. But they're missing some of those large impacts. And so Moses is reiterating this for them. It's not rebinding them to the covenant because they're already bound to it. But you can maybe think of it in that way. This is reaffirming, they're reaffirming their covenant, reaffirming their baptism like we do at Easter. So that's kind of the way to think of what's happening here. So we see the history. And we'll kind of go through the order here. First, God gives order to Israel. This is where it starts out at the beginning of that first sermon. Moses reminds the Israelites how they should govern themselves when they're gone. There's a practical purpose to starting with this. Moses reminds them that we were too many for one person to command. We were too many who would lose sight of God. And so God said, set up for yourselves wise leaders in charge of your thousands, your hundreds, your tens, and have them be the people that you go to bring up complaints and problems so that it can be addressed properly for the person, and make them wise leaders so that there is no bias, so that they hear the good, like the great ones, the rich ones who bring complaints, and they hear the poor people who bring complaints. There is supposed to be no bias in the judges I don't know if that's the term I should use, in the people they appoint over themselves. And so Moses reiterates here the order that God gave to Israel so that they can take care of themselves. This is the order that they reject later on when they ask for a king instead, when they want to be like the nations around them. They're rejecting this God-given order to them of what God said is a good way for them to lead themselves. When it comes to that, is that the best way to lead ourselves? Maybe, but it was the best way for Israel to do it. God commanded Israel specifically to lead themselves in that way. So they were supposed to, and they didn't. There are some people who will look to Israel to see, well, should we follow the government of Israel since it was given by God? It could work in some instances, and it might not work in others, because God was speaking to Israel in the time of Israel when he set up this government. So I've heard that, I've heard people talk about that before, so I thought I would mention it while we're going through it. We then move on, and Moses recounts how they sent the 12 spies into Canaan, and they disobeyed. 12 spies went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. I can sing too, Pastor. Not well, but I can sing too. I wish the mic had gone out for that part. So for all of Israel's adults, all of their warrior age men, only Caleb and Joshua, the 2 good spies, only them would be able to enter the promised land. Everybody else who was a rebellious warrior, that's kind of the phrase they use, had to die in the wilderness. That's where that 40 years comes in. So to give you the exact happening, because we did kind of miss some of Numbers with Maundy, Thursday, and Easter week. So to give you a little bit of an overview of that part that we missed, because that's a big part of Numbers, is they send in the 12 spies. They say it's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's prosperous, right? It's not rivers of milk, but it is prosperous. The land is fertile. It's a great place to live. Grapes the size of your head, all those fun embellishments. But the 10 spies saw the people there, bigger and stronger than them. They had fortified cities. They were afraid of them. And they told Israel, no, 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 we should not go in there. We will have our butts handed to us. All right. So that was the 10 bad spies. And Joshua and Caleb, they said, no, look, the land is good for taking and God has promised it to us. Well, all of Israel decided to rebel and not enter when God told them to enter. So God pronounced on them, fine, you're going to go and wander for 40 years until you're ready to take this land. And then Israelites were like, wait a second. I don't want to sit around and wait for 40 years. Maybe we can pick up our swords and go in there and fight. Yeah, God, we're going to go do what you commanded us to do. So they all get their swords and they're like, we're going to go in to fight. And Moses is like, well, maybe you shouldn't. And then they did it anyway. And they went in to go fight and they found the Amorites. And the exact words that Moses uses are, and they chased you around like bees from one end of the land to the other. They chased you like bees and you came back weeping because you lost, because God wasn't in your midst, because you disobeyed him and he told you to wander and then you thought that you could fix the problem. Well, they couldn't. And so we have the 40 years put on them and this warrior rebellious generation. That's why he calls them the rebel warriors. That is the case. They tried to go back in and fight after they said they wouldn't, and God was like, fine, then take your punishment. And they're like, oh, well, maybe we can fix this. I'll go take out the trash now. But the trash was supposed to be taken out at 6 a.m. so the dumpster truck could get it. And now the trash is going to sit full for another week. I've done that more than enough times since moving here. So it should sound personal, Art. This is our God. This is the story of our history of God and calling up the people, the same God who moves on to be our Redeemer of all creation. It is personal, Art. So then they get to the 40 years of wandering. What do you assume when you hear the word wandering? Wandering. You've all seen the joke about the Moses needing a GPS and the little map that says it should be a 3-day walk from Egypt to Israel. You've all seen that little joke before. I didn't pull it up and I probably should have, but there's those jokes out there, those pictures that show how long it should have taken to walk. And then they show Moses with a bunch of squiggly lines throughout the desert. But realistically, what was happening was that they were kind of parked in one place for the majority of that 40 years. It wasn't them wandering lost. It was them stuck and waiting because they disobeyed. It's almost worse in that sense because they know that they're just waiting to die. They're sitting there in the desert of sin, and the term that they use now is Kadesh Barnea, I believe. I think that's the phrase, Kadesh Barnea. They're stuck in a 40-year traffic jam, and there is no bathroom in sight. So they're waiting, and that wandering in the desert is a little bit of a misnomer. They're not really just traveling around. They're kind of parked there and just waiting. That's a big complaint that people have with Deuteronomy when they say, well, it can't be realistic. The desert of sin couldn't have supported that many people to live there. And it's like, yeah, if God wasn't taking care of them, that's kind of the point. The whole point is that they shouldn't be where they are today without God. They wouldn't have escaped Egypt. They wouldn't have even tried to leave Egypt. They wouldn't have beaten the different armies in their way. They wouldn't have survived in the desert for 40 years. Without God, Israel should be fully and absolutely dead or still slaves in Egypt. There was no other option unless God was with them. So the proof that you need is the fact that Israel is still around. God did provide for them in that desert for 40 years. And then we get to the caroming of Sihon and Og. So this is a problem that was already brought to my attention that people have an issue with. How do we address the fact? And we're just going to be blunt. You can't hide the Bible. God commanded them, and they went in and they wiped out the entirety of Sihon and Og. They're all the men who fought, and the women and the children. Everyone was destroyed. Then cities were torn down. The goods and the animals were devoted to God to be taken for him. And so we have a clear indication. God said, wipe out everyone. And they did multiple times. What actually went wrong in Canaan is the fact that they didn't wipe out everyone when God told them to. So how do we address that? Because I'll tell you what, it is never going to be palatable, especially for the American Christian, to hear that God said wipe out everybody. And it is by no means the standard of war for every nation. That is not what we do in war either. So what's happening with this kareming, this to make nothing? The Greek makes every one of these words anathema, to mean like literally to make nothing. You are nothing. You are anathema. That is what this word is usually translated into Greek as. So they can be troublesome for us to read. So why is this commanded by God, and why is God able to command us? Those two questions kind of go together. So we need to understand the situation at hand. This is Israel, and God has made them his chosen people. So what's happening here is God who has, let's go back so that I'm not messing this up, because this is a part I probably shouldn't mess up. There's two things happening with this kareming. God addressing Israel and God addressing the other nations. So we have to understand, God is God of all creation. That is set up and clear and to the point. God is the God of all creation. All nations belong to him. We see this when he hardens Pharaoh's heart. We see it when it said he hardens Sihon's heart. We see it when Israel is beaten by nations and God says, I use Babylon and Assyria to wipe you out because you've disobeyed and spread you out and put you into slavery. God controls the nations. He controls history. It is his doing. Now those nations go and sin, and that's where the destruction comes in. So let's talk first in regards to Israel. God is saying this law, this kareming of the nations that they're moving into the promised land, focusing on the first commandment for Israel's sake. You shall have no other gods. And the issue is that all the Canaanites have other gods. And Israel has already seen that they pretty easily go off and worship other gods based on the neighbors around them. These laws to karem is to protect Israel as God's chosen people, because they are not to follow other gods. They've already shown that if there's a God near them, they're probably going to start worshiping it. Golden calf and a number of others. We'll just stop with golden calf. I feel like that's enough of an example. God could have stopped with that one. So this is done for Israel's sake, so that when they enter the promised land, they will be pure and holy. We go back to the Levitical laws, right? A focus on being set apart, a focus on being pure and holy. So that's part of this kareming. Okay, great. So what about those other nations? Why are they being completely wiped out? How can God do that? God is the God of all creation. And it once again goes back to the first commandment. What does idolatry lead to? All right, what does idolatry lead to? What were these other nations doing? Thanks for catching on to that one. They were doing idolatry, right? We see some blessings for the people. We see that God promised Esau's kids and Lot's kids land. So Israel was not to fight with Edom and with Ammon and with for Moab, the other one. So they were not to fight with those three because they were a promise of land to Esau and to Lot. God made that promise, and those nations then, to an extent, we do see a few times where there are still people who worship Yahweh, who still worship the true God, not the nations as a whole. And God has chosen Israel to be his specific nation. But we see examples of that. We see the priest of Midian, so Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. We see this with not necessarily worshiping him, but Balaam's donkey. Balaam knew of the Lord, even if he was a shyster and wasn't praying to God and only God, right? He was doing some pretty wacky stuff as well with that. So we do see that Yahweh is known in some of these nations. And Balaam was Edomite, I believe, correct? Yeah. So we do see that. But God has chosen Israel. And these other nations, these Canaanites, are in idolatry. It is, however much we don't want to admit it, entirely within God's right to destroy them. Fun fact, it's entirely within God's right to have destroyed each and every one of us for all of our sin. He could have wiped out creation and just been done with us. So that's God's right as a just and righteous God. It's also his right to have grace and mercy on us, which is why we are still alive, which is why he had a chosen nation, which is why he sent his son to die on the cross to rise again. Christ is risen. I don't get to say it very often. We see that, yes, God has the right. We should fully admit that. If God wanted to, he could speak, and just as quickly as creation burst into existence, he could destroy it. But it's his grace and mercy that we focus on, because he decided not to destroy all of us. Did he destroy these nations? Yes. And they did deserve it. They were in idolatry. Could he destroy us in the exact same way? Yes. And we would deserve it as sinners. Thanks be to God that we are forgiven, that he has mercy and grace on us, that he takes away our punishment and instead gives us forgiveness of sins, salvation, and life everlasting. So yes, it's unpalatable to hear. But that's because we as sinners don't like to hear that we deserve death because we're sinners. That's the unpalatable part. It's not that, oh, the Old Testament, that's bloody and violent. It could be that at all times, but it's not because of that same God's grace and mercy. So we have to see those two things, his righteousness, his justness, and his grace and mercy. We have to see those two things at the same time. Just like we as Lutherans like this, law and gospel, we have to see them at the same time. We can't separate them and look at just one or the other and ignore something. So that is the Kareming. We don't always like it. It can be dark. And sometimes we don't like it because that could really be coming back and looking at ourselves. We could have been those people. But it is the case. And it wasn't wrong for God to order that. So we have an issue with that. People have an issue hearing that. I'll stop for 3 seconds to see if somebody had a question on that part specifically. That's been asked a few times already.
It's also though the reverse to the argument where people ask me like all the time, how can you believe in a God that lets bad things happen? Well, when he took care of it, you were mad at that too. Because that's usually, well, you killed all these people back in there.
Yeah.
For a reason.
So in case you didn't hear, people asking Art, well, why do you believe in a God that lets bad things happen? And Art points to this and he's like, well, look, you didn't like it when he handled it either. So what do you want? Do you want him to leave it be or do you want him to handle it? And the great thing is that God did handle it, right? We have something called the theology of the cross, because it's on the cross that God dealt with all of the sin, where God showed us his grace and mercy. That is where God deals with the bad, with the suffering, with the sin, with the pain. He dealt with it all on the cross. All right. We'll keep moving so I can hit a few things before we have to close. 10 Commandments revisited, the 10 words revisited. So I was going to come in here. Oh, I've got a chat. I don't know how long ago that was. Phylacteries, the boxes on the Jewish foreheads and left arms, they are phylacteries. That was the term. Thank you. I finally looked at that. So I was going to come up and make an apology for messing up the 10 Commandments the first time with Exodus, because I mixed up, because I had thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house, and then we had, or wives, and then house and everything. But it switches around. It switches. The 9th and 10th commandment in Exodus is different than the 9th and 10th commandment in Deuteronomy. What the heck, Moses? All right. So I was gonna come up and say that I got that all wrong when I made that sheet for you, which I copied from previous years and Pastor copied from previous years. And that's because that was taking the Deuteronomy version, which does have wife and then everything else, versus Exodus, which has house and then everything else. So they make those distinctions in the two. It sounds like two different things. And if I'm mixing up those two and it's the other way around, I'm sorry, it's okay. It's those two ways are the differences. One is in Deuteronomy, one is in Exodus. So what do we actually do with that? Because there are some differences as we read. What are these 10 words revisited? Right? There's actually 13 sentences. 16 in English, I think, but 13 sentences. And some Christians combine the first and second or separate it, so no other gods and graven images. And Catholics and Lutherans and the ones closer to the Catholic Church do one as just you shall have no other gods, graven images included, and 9 and 10 are separated. So what do we do with that? And I'm actually going to pull down this because I thought this was a really neat handout. Between Catholic and Protestant, we understand. I brought up the Jewish one because they look at the 10 Commandments too. And they make their first commandment, I am the Lord your God who has taken you out of the land of Egypt. And me and Pastor were joking about this. And I'm like, oh, we should just combine both the first and second and the 9th and 10th and make it 9 commandments. And the Jews kind of do that. They just make I am the Lord your God who takes you out of the land of Egypt as their first commandment. And then you shall have no other gods. That's 1 and 2 combined. And then you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. There's 9 and 10 combined. I kind of like the Jewish 10 commandments. All right, it makes a little bit more sense. And we actually have Lutherans who will admit, I was reading the commentary today, produced by Concordia, and the Lutherans will say, look, it really makes no sense because of the way that Deuteronomy and Exodus flip back and forth. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to separate 9 and 10. We do it because of tradition, and thus we still do it because it's easier than telling everybody, hey, we're switching it for this reason, and people aren't going to be happy about us switching it. And it doesn't actually matter to our faith. The laws are still there. We're not denying any of the laws and having the 10 Commandments written differently. But likely, we probably shouldn't split the 9th and 10th, but we do because of the tradition of the church. Luther took what the Catholics did. We still do that today. And that's okay, because we aren't denying that it's part of the 10 Commandments, and we aren't forgetting that something else is part of it. Graven images is still included in you shall have no other gods. That said, I'm a huge fan of the Jewish 10 Commandments, and I've got to wrap up completely. Do I have like 2 minutes? Pastor, no offense, I kind of like it when you're gone. I can push the Fine. I've had the obligations of the suzerain placed upon me. All right, receive this blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and to give his countenance towards you. And I forget the countenance is the last one. This would help if I had it written down.
Lord, make his face shine upon you. The Lord look upon you with favor and grant you peace.
That one. I had a fun game where I was going to trick you guys down here at the end with separate these words. It's God on one side and everything else on the other, because creator and creation. And Jesus is part of the creation process, which puts him firmly in line with God. That's how we address the Shema. That's how we address the Lord your God as one. Anything that creates has to be God. Jesus creates, therefore Jesus is God.